Hello, this is Vision Denial and the road to MSI 2022. My name is Sam, and for those unfamiliar, this show, I watch every single playoff game from all 11 participating regions for MSI. Yes, including that one. But I've already watched them all. So what's this? This is the Meet the Teams. And today we're meeting the 9th qualifying team straight from the CBLOL Brazilian region, the Red Canids Kalunga. For many international fans, you'll recognize them as the representatives of the World Championships in 2021. A lot of upstarts and fancy go-getters who unfortunately could not bring it up to them to make it to the group stage. But they're here and ready to go as they have finally qualified in a huge gauntlet. So, without further ado, let's meet this team. First with the coaching staff. Guigo over here has been the coach of the Red Canids for some time, since at least 2018 of July, and has been fairly consistent for this team, gradually improving them to the point where they've been able to get to now 2 international tournaments at this point. Now, this particular team with the abilities to really play towards their side lanes first and foremost, really enjoy their siege and flanking type of compositions. Really hoping to play against that and avoid it from their opponents as well. This region really liking their topside play. They ban a lot of also siege and team fight oriented champions, whilst also having a large amount of early game turret focus. So what does this look like overall for them? Well, unfortunately, even though drafting frequently for the sake of early game push and priority, it doesn't always land that way. Much of their wins during the season came straight from the playoffs, having lost very handedly against Kaboom in the first go. They then proceeded to go 3-2, 3-1, 3-1, and then 3-2 again in a very difficult gauntlet. And they do try very hard to put a lot of the pressure early. But I think the biggest key here is that they recognize when they're behind and frequently attempt to neutralize leads more than anything else. They find times to find heralds really early. They don't take always the first Drake of the game, actually more leaning towards giving it up a lot of the times. And while they've drafted for early games, for early game drafts, or a lot of teams have recognized this, a lot of their metrics come from being able to catch back up during the mid game. Now, this can be a large issue going forward against a lot of these international teams, but I'm fairly impressed by the way that they neutralize their particular opponent's leads whilst still trying to keep up with them. Unfortunately, we'll see if that holds out against in the international scene. So, let's meet the players as are. Starting in the top lane with Guigo. Now, Guigo over here has been with the Red Canids since the start of his career, being a substitute top laner since 2018 and getting the chance in the main roster finally in 2019. He's been not the most consistent, I would say. Where he lacks in his ability to stay with ahead in terms of any particular lane participation, he does, however, have a fairly high first blood participation, and indicating primarily the way that they like to play around the neutral objectives as much as possible. This team understands that Guigo may not be the strongest early game laner, but he is an incredibly prolific team fighter. A lot of his particular champion picks, even though a lot are side lane based champions, he does find methods to create team fighting and space around any particular scenario that they find in. And he's also very good at, even though he's may not always be ahead in these lanes, he tries his best to not fall behind too much. Noticing that much of his XP differential, gold differential, and CS differential are in the negatives, they're not by huge margins. So most of his time is spent nullifying and making sure that he hits his particular milestones just so that he's ready for the mid-game transition. Now, this may, however, be a little difficult against many of his counterparts in the top lane as we get towards MSI. Aegis, on the other hand, his jungle contemporary, reflects more of what they are aiming for in terms of being able to play early game. Aegis has been able to finally enter in 2020, in April of 2020, in terms of the main roster, having gone back and forth between Academy and Substitute. So far in 2022, has made a big splash for himself as being a very aggressive go-getter, finding a large amount of success in enabling his lanes and making sure that he personally helps stifle many of the issues that those laners get at that point, whilst also keeping up himself and excelling way ahead, frequently being 1 to 2 camps ahead while also still helping with the rest of his lane and getting a hold of many of the neutral objectives around the map. He is a very busy jungler, and he has much of what he applies and plays is not the tank front lines, but he plays much more as an assassin bruiser type player. His Jarvans, his Hekrams are much more on the carry-oriented side, and much of his picks really excel when he does get the ball rolling, being one of the primary carries for his team. Moving on to the mid lane, part of what I was talking about Aegis being somebody who tries to help nullify and enable his laners whilst still being ahead, Grevthar is primarily who I think about a lot of the time. Being one of the weakest and most inflexible mid laners of CBLOL, of the Brazilian League, you can see it reflected in the types of champions that he plays, what he's successful at, what he's not as successful at. And by all accounts, when he has the chance to team fight, he is very consistent and honestly superb in a lot of these senses of how to play with the space, how to zone properly, how to upkeep his damage as much as possible. But it's hard for me to think that this is largely going to be effective when he is so far behind on a consistent basis. Regularly 13 CS behind at 15 minutes. Regularly almost 300 gold behind on a consistent basis versus his laner. And his XP differential regularly being behind. He does not apply enough pressure for me to think that he will be able to translate much of this against all of the other mid laners he's going to have to face in his group. Almost every single one of them will outclass him, and this may become a linchpin unless he shores up his laning phase issues. If he does, and Aegis, as well as the rest of his team, is able to bolster up to the mid game, he can show great team fighting prowess, and he does on a regular basis. But we'll have to see if he actually makes it over to that point. Next, we have Titan. And honestly, as a frequent theme of this particular team, their laners are still fairly lackluster compared to their jungler. But Titan, just like Guigo, instead of being more inflexible, has a lot of more flexibility to his kit and is able to play around that a lot more often. Some of his negative stats come frequently because of his need to play on the losing end, but he is also not the strongest bot laner of the league. The team regularly tries to put a lot of resources into him, having a large amount of the first blood participation of his team, but most of this is usually to shore up and make sure that he can survive to the mid game. And as they get to the mid game transition, much of this team strength again is in the team fighting, and Titan is no exception. Being a superstar team fighter and with a lot of attitude, you can see from his cam, he will find any opportunity to try to move forward and try to find any chances to out damage his opponents. So, what about his lane partner? Well, his lane partner is that one silly anime reference. All right, cool. Joke's over. Jojo is honestly fairly flexible and very willing to go any particular direction. The issue is that his consistency comes primarily from two picks, his Renata and his Leona, where he's able to create a lot of zoning and a lot of re-engage, but only around neutral objectives and during the mid-game and so on. Honestly, much of this team shows the same kind of like lackluster ability to do a lot of roaming, and Jojo is no exception. He should quite frequently be warding a lot more, but his vision score still being pretty average, and his clearing is a little under the weather. Jojo doesn't strike me as one of the most impressive players amongst the support lineups going into this international tournament. But the Canids picked him up in 2020, in November of 2020, just to get on for the last 2 years, and he's been consistent enough in being able to enable Titan during these team fights, which is crucially where it is most important for this team. And when it comes to team fights, he's still fairly consistent. It's just mostly everywhere else in between that requires a lot more work. So my thoughts? Well, the Red Canids are a lot of fun to watch when it comes to the mid to late game team fighting, but the unfortunate nature is that they're usually trying very hard to nullify their gold deficits more than anything else. And because of this, I'm more hesitant to think that they're actually going to be doing very well in the MSI. They've done great strides in improvement series after series, but they're usually off of very marginal differences that their opponents were not able to capitalize on a lot of these situations. And so, like, any of their opponents qualifying may have done possibly slightly better, but not much more. And the Canids probably have a stronger chance at being able to find these random moments of punishing an opponent who does not close out properly, who doesn't properly set up their neutral objectives, who isn't doing their lane allocations properly, because the Canids will nullify as much as possible and find avenues to be able to create team fights that they are successful in. Because that's the thing that most struck out to me. They choose their fights very well. Even while behind by either 1,000 or 2,000 gold, they will only pick opportunities to fight when it suits them. And quite honestly, kudos, because you're going to need that more often than not, given your kind of record across all three laners playing to the negative. But we'll see. What do you guys think? Do you think the Red Canids have better shot than I expect? I'd love to hear your thoughts below. If you like this kind of content, like and subscribe. I will be doing these Meet the Teams as we go forward. So with that, I'll see you next time. Bye.